The morning of October 14th, 1998, began with the smell of wet hemlock and stale coffee. Elias sat on the edge of the wrap-around porch of his family cabin. He held a rusted claw hammer in his right hand. The cabin sat perched on the literal edge of Blackwood Ridge. Below them lay a vertical drop of nearly 1,000 feet into a sea of dense green canopy. The air was perfectly still. Nothing moved in the vast valley below. It was a Tuesday. Sarah was inside the small kitchen frying eggs in a heavy cast-iron skillet. The grease popped and hissed against the metal. Elias brought the hammer down hard on a loose floorboard. The sharp crack rang out into the crisp morning air. It bounced off the distant gray granite walls of the gorge. It was just another completely quiet autumn morning in the Appalachian Mountains. Before we go any further into what happened on this ridge, let me know down in the comments what part of the world you are tuning in from tonight. It is always wild to see how far these stories travel. Anyway, Elias wiped the dry sawdust from his faded denim jeans. He stood up and stretched the knot in his lower back. He could hear his 7-year-old son Leo dragging a plastic yellow dump truck across the hardwood floor inside the house. The morning sky was a pale, flat gray. A thick marine layer of cold fog clung to the deep basin of the valley like heavy cotton. Elias walked over to the wooden railing and leaned over. He stared down into the swirling mist. He had lived on Blackwood Ridge for 32 years. He knew the sounds of the mountain intimately. He knew the difference between a white-tailed deer snapping a dry twig and a black bear tearing into a rotted log. He knew the specific hollow sound the wind made when a severe storm was blowing in from the east. It was a peaceful life out here. It was completely disconnected from the noise and chaos of the city. Sarah pushed the screen door open with her hip. She handed Elias a warm ceramic mug. The thick steam curled up into the freezing air and vanished into the fog. She did not say a single word. She just leaned her head against his shoulder. They stood there in complete silence for 10 minutes. They watched the thick fog slowly burn off as the sun breached the jagged eastern peaks. The coffee tasted bitter and earthy. Elias took a very slow sip. He felt the liquid warmth spread deep through his chest. Everything was exactly as it should be. The woodpile was fully stocked for the coming brutal winter. The metal gutters were cleaned out. The generator in the shed had a full tank of diesel fuel. Around 10:15 a.m., Leo finally wandered out onto the wooden porch. He was wearing an oversized red flannel shirt and no shoes. He squeezed tightly between his parents and grabbed the wet wooden railing with both of his small hands. He looked down into the deep green abyss of the valley. Leo absolutely loved the echo. It was a simple game he played almost every single morning. He would shout a random word and wait for the ancient mountain to throw it back. It was a harmless and entirely routine childhood habit. Leo took a massive breath. He cupped his small hands around his mouth. He shouted a long and drawn-out hello into the vast open gorge. Elias and Sarah stood quietly, waiting for the familiar acoustic bounce. 1 second passed, then 2 seconds passed. Usually the return sound was almost instantaneous. Today there was a strange and heavy delay. It was a thick silence. Then the sound finally returned. It climbed up from the very bottom of the gorge. Hello, but something was immediately wrong. The pitch was slightly deeper than a 7-year-old boy. The cadence was entirely off. Leo had dragged out the word, making it last for 3 full seconds. The returning voice was incredibly short. It was clipped. It was highly authoritative. Elias frowned deeply. He looked down at his young son. Leo looked deeply confused. The boy tried again. He shouted his own name into the swirling mist. Leo. The family waited by the railing. The heavy fog shifted slowly below them. The silence stretched out for a full 5 seconds. It felt entirely unnatural. When the sound finally came back, it was not a loud shout. It was spoken at a normal conversational volume. It sounded exactly as if someone was standing just 100 feet down the steep, muddy incline. The deep voice said, "We know." Sarah instantly dropped her warm ceramic mug. It shattered against the wooden porch planks. Hot coffee splashed heavily across Elias and his leather work boots. Neither of them moved a single muscle. The ambient air temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Elias felt a sudden cold sweat break out across his forehead. He aggressively grabbed Leo by the shoulder and pulled the boy securely behind him. He stepped right up to the wooden railing. He demanded to know who was hiding down there. He yelled at the absolute top of his lungs. He violently threatened to call the police. He shouted that he had a loaded hunting rifle inside the cabin. The thick mist rolled slowly over the tops of the pine trees. The dead silence returned to the ridge. Elias waited with his fists clenched. He counted the agonizing seconds in his head. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Nothing happened. He let out a long, trembling breath. He frantically tried to convince himself it was just a trespassing hiker playing a cruel and elaborate joke. He turned his head to tell Sarah to take Leo inside the house immediately. As he opened his mouth to speak, the deep valley answered him. It was not a stranger this time. It was Elias. It was his exact own voice bouncing back up the cliff face. But the voice was not repeating his angry threats. The voice echoing up from the dense fog spoke in a totally calm and terrifyingly flat tone. The voice said, "The phone lines are cut, Elias, and your rifle is unloaded in the hall closet." Absolute panic set in instantly. Elias violently shoved his wife and child backward through the open front door. He slammed the heavy wood shut and locked the brass deadbolt. He ran frantically to the narrow hall closet. He tore the cardboard shoeboxes off the top shelf. He grabbed his heavy hunting rifle and frantically checked the steel chamber. It was completely empty. He checked the green ammunition box sitting right next to it. The thick cardboard was torn open. The heavy brass cartridges were completely gone. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He ran across the room to the kitchen wall and picked up the old rotary phone. He frantically dialed 911. The line was completely dead. There was no dial tone whatsoever. There was no static. There was only a heavy and hollow void. The autumn sun began to set rapidly around 5:45 p.m. The dark shadows inside the remote cabin grew incredibly long and severely distorted. Elias aggressively nailed thick wool blankets over all the glass windows. He dragged the heavy, solid oak dining table completely against the front door. Sarah sat huddled on the old fabric couch with Leo. She held him incredibly tightly against her chest. The young boy was crying silently into her shirt. The house was completely quiet. They did not turn on a single lamp. They sat in the pitch dark. They listened to the mountain. At exactly 8:30 p.m., the terrifying noises started outside. It began as a soft rustling sound in the dry autumn leaves at the very bottom of the steep ridge. It was a collective and rhythmic crunching. It sounded exactly like dozens of extremely heavy footsteps moving deliberately through the dense brush. The terrible sound was moving upward. It was coming straight up the mountain. Elias knelt slowly by the front window. He peeled back a tiny fraction of a corner of the wool blanket. He peered out into the pitch-black night. The fog had returned in full force. It was significantly thicker now. It pressed directly against the cold glass like a living gray wall. A distinct voice drifted up softly from the darkness outside. It was Sarah this time. It was her exact vocal fry. It was her exact nervous stutter. The voice from the dark woods said, "Please let us in. It is so incredibly cold out here." The real Sarah violently clamped both of her hands over her ears. She buried her face deeply into the sofa cushions. The voice outside continued speaking. It did not sound scared at all. It sounded terrifyingly patient. The voice said, "We just want to sit by the warm fire." Elias tightly gripped the empty hunting rifle. His knuckles turned stark white in the gloom. The putrid smell of rotting wet leaves and metallic ozone began to seep rapidly through the tiny cracks in the floorboards of the cabin. The stagnant air inside grew incredibly thick and very hard to breathe. The relentless rustling outside was getting much closer. It sounded as though the heavy footsteps had finally reached the 200-foot mark directly below the ridge. Thick, dry branches snapped violently under immense weight. Whatever was climbing the mountain did not care about being quiet anymore. They wanted to be heard. A brand new voice suddenly joined the terrifying chorus in the dark. It was Elias again. The fake Elias yelled out, "I'm going to break the glass window now!" The voice was totally devoid of any human emotion. It was a completely flat statement of pure fact. Elias backed away quickly from the glass pane. He pressed his back flat against the hallway wall. He waited in agony for the sudden sound of shattering glass. It never came. Instead, the small, innocent voice of his son echoed up from the dark tree line. The fake Leo giggled. It was a horrible and wet, gurgling laugh. The voice said, "I can see you through the tiny crack in the blanket, Daddy." Elias felt his chest tighten painfully. He looked directly at the dark window. The tiny corner of the wool blanket he had pulled back was still folded over. Just a single inch of exposed glass remained visible. He stared paralyzed at that dark, vertical rectangle. A pale and completely unnatural shape slowly drifted into view on the other side of the glass. It was a face. It was pressed completely flat against the window pane. The facial features were violently smeared and almost totally featureless, like wet gray clay melting in a heavy rainstorm. There were absolutely no eyes. There was only a wide and gaping black hole, exactly where a human mouth should be. The featureless face slowly dragged itself all the way down the glass. It left a thick and greasy smear of dark gray residue. Elias could not breathe. He could not force himself to speak. The heavy rustling sound outside had completely stopped. The entities were no longer climbing the steep incline. They had finally reached the top of the ridge. They were standing directly on the front lawn. They were standing right on the wooden porch. The thick wooden planks groaned loudly under the shifting weight of multiple unseen bodies. The cabin settled into an absolute and terrifying silence. The forest crickets were entirely dead. The harsh autumn wind had died completely. For 3 agonizingly long hours, the family sat totally paralyzed in the dark. It was now exactly 11:15 p.m. The temperature inside the small cabin had completely plummeted. Thick white frost began to form rapidly on the inside of the window panes. Every single breath Sarah took resulted in a massive plume of white vapor. Leo was shivering so violently that his small teeth were chattering loudly. Then the brass front doorknob began to turn very slowly. It rattled violently against the locked deadbolt. The heavy, solid oak table shifted a tiny fraction of an inch across the smooth hardwood floor. Elias jumped rapidly forward. He threw his entire body weight directly against the heavy table. He braced his leather boots aggressively against the floorboards. The immense physical pressure from the other side of the door was totally overwhelming. It felt exactly as though a heavy industrial bulldozer was pushing against the aging wood. The metal hinges squealed in protest. The solid wood splintered slightly near the metal lock. A voice spoke loudly from directly on the other side of the solid wood door. It was no more than 1 single inch away from where Elias was pushing. It was his own voice again. The cruel imitation was absolutely flawless. It captured the exact, gravelly exhaustion present in his dry throat. The voice whispered softly, "You cannot keep us out forever. We have absolutely nowhere else to go." Another voice immediately joined it. It was Sarah. Her horrifying duplicate voice chimed in. She said, "We are already forgetting exactly what it feels like to be real. We desperately need your body heat." Elias closed his eyes tightly. Hot tears streamed steadily down his cold face. He pushed backward against the table until his leg muscles cramped painfully. He flatly refused to answer them. He knew instinctively that speaking back to them would only give them more of his sound to steal. They were actively learning his unique cadence. They were aggressively absorbing the acoustic signature of his entire life. He remained totally silent. He focused entirely on the raw physical resistance of the wooden door. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the immense pressure suddenly stopped. The violent pushing ceased entirely. The horrible mimicking voices went completely quiet. The thick porch planks groaned loudly one final time as the heavy weight shifted away from the cabin. Elias did not move a single muscle. He stayed completely braced against the heavy oak table. He listened intently to the dark night. He fully expected to hear the loud crunch of heavy footsteps receding back down the steep mountain. He expected them to retreat back into the deep valley. He heard absolutely nothing. The silence was absolute and total. Sarah slowly lifted her head from the dark couch. She whispered his name very softly. She asked if the monsters were finally gone. Elias shook his head rapidly in the dark room. He raised a single trembling finger to his chapped lips. He desperately begged her silently to stay completely quiet. He slowly backed away from the damaged door. He crept silently toward the narrow hallway. He wanted to check the heavy back door located in the kitchen. Every single step he took seemed incredibly loud. The cold floorboards creaked terribly beneath his boots. He finally reached the kitchen threshold. The metallic smell of ozone was overwhelmingly strong in this room. It smelled exactly like a blown electrical transformer mixed heavily with stagnant swamp water. The small kitchen was absolutely freezing. The old linoleum floor was completely slick with frozen condensation. He looked intently at the heavy back door. The metal deadbolt was still fully turned. The security chain was still firmly engaged. Nothing had been broken into. Nothing had been forced open from the outside. Elias let out a massive and shaking sigh of pure relief. He turned around very slowly to walk back into the living room. As he turned his body, he heard a sound that made his heart stop entirely. It came from directly above his head. It came from the dark attic. It was the highly distinct sound of a plastic dump truck rolling slowly across the exposed wooden rafters. The small plastic wheels scraped loudly against the bare wood ceiling. The terrible sound rolled slowly from the kitchen space directly toward the living room ceiling, exactly over where Sarah and Leo were currently hiding. Elias stared straight up at the ceiling. The only attic access panel was located directly in the main hallway. He had firmly padlocked it shut over 3 years ago. He slowly walked backward out into the dark hall. He looked straight up. The heavy metal padlock was completely gone. The square wooden hatch was pushed slightly open. A black and gaping void stared directly down at him from the ceiling. From the terrifying darkness of the attic, a voice drifted slowly down into the hallway. It was Leo. The voice was incredibly small and deeply frightened. The voice said, "Daddy, there is someone else up here in the dark with me." Elias completely froze. He looked rapidly back toward the dark living room. The real Leo was still sitting firmly on the couch, right next to Sarah. The young boy was fast asleep. His chest rose and fell in a totally steady rhythm. The voice speaking from the attic belonged entirely to the thing from the valley. The fake Sarah spoke loudly from the attic next. Her voice sounded exactly at the edge of the open wooden hatch. She whispered directly down to Elias in the dark. She said, "The roof was so incredibly soft, Elias. The old shingles just peeled right away like dead human skin. We are inside the house now. We are right above you. We're going to come down the wooden ladder now." The folding wooden attic stairs began to slowly unfold downward. The rusted metal springs groaned terribly loudly in the absolutely quiet house. The old wooden ladder descended segment by segment until the wooden feet touched the hallway floor. The overwhelming smell of pure decay flooded the narrow corridor. The dead air grew so cold that Elias could actually feel tiny crystals of ice forming directly on his eyelashes. He stood completely paralyzed at the bottom of the ladder. He looked straight up into the suffocating and heavy darkness of the attic space. He could hear them breathing heavily. It was a horrible, wet, and heavy rasping sound. Multiple sets of terrible lungs struggling to process the cold air. The first foot stepped slowly onto the very top rung of the wooden ladder. It was completely barefoot. The skin was a pale and entirely translucent shade of gray. It looked exactly like the bloated flesh of a long-drowned animal. The long toes were severely elongated and strangely double-jointed. They gripped the wooden rung exactly like the sharp talons of a massive bird of prey. Elias could not force himself to look away. The sheer absolute impossibility of the tall creature paralyzed his rational mind. It defied all human logic. It was a physical and terrible manifestation of a stolen echo. It was an impossible acoustic anomaly that had somehow grown a physical body out of the mountain fog and stolen sound waves. A second smaller entity stepped slowly onto the wooden ladder directly behind the first tall creature. This one was significantly smaller. It was the exact precise height of a 7-year-old boy. It let out a low and wet gurgling giggle. The terrible sound bounced sharply off the narrow hallway walls. It filled Elias with a total sense of absolute despair. The horrific entities began to descend very slowly. They moved with highly jerky and totally unnatural motions. Their terrible joints popped and cracked incredibly loudly with every single step downward. They absolutely did not have faces. Their large heads were entirely smooth and blank domes of gray flesh, with dark and sunken depressions located exactly where mouths should have been. Elias backed away incredibly slowly into the main living room. He reached blindly behind his back and tightly grabbed Sarah. He pulled her aggressively up from the fabric couch. He scooped the heavily sleeping Leo entirely into his left arm. The three of them backed slowly into the far dark corner of the main room. They pressed themselves completely flat against the rough, cold stone of the dead fireplace. The tall entities reached the very bottom of the ladder. They stepped slowly off onto the smooth, hardwood floor. They stood completely still in the dark hallway just outside the reach of the ambient moonlight. The tallest entity turned its completely blank and smooth face directly toward the living room corner. It stood completely, perfectly still for one entirely agonizing minute. Then it finally spoke aloud. It used Elias's exact deep voice. It spoke with his exact natural inflection. It cleared its wet throat exactly the way Elias always did when he was extremely nervous. The gray creature said, "You can finally go to sleep now. We will happily take over all the morning chores. We will successfully raise the young boy." The second entity, mimicking Sarah, stepped very slowly forward into the room. It reached out a very long and gray and horribly multi-jointed arm straight toward the trapped family. It spoke softly in a highly soothing and completely motherly tone. It said, "It is so incredibly exhausting being real all the time. Just close your weary eyes and let us have the entire rest of your days." The much smaller third creature pushed violently past them. It dragged a small wooden toy truck forcefully across the floorboards. It walked directly and purposefully toward the real sleeping Leo. The cold house settled back into a heavy and suffocating silence. The thick fog outside pressed incredibly tightly against the dark wool blankets covering the windows. The real family remained completely trapped in the freezing corner of their very own home. They listened in total horror to their exact own voices calmly plotting their permanent replacement. The gray entities stood entirely motionless in the center of the dark living room. They did not attack aggressively. They did not rush rapidly forward. They simply waited in the dark. They knew the freezing cold would absolutely eventually force the exhausted humans to close their eyes. They knew the ancient mountain completely belonged to them now. The dark echoes had finally come home.
The story we are diving into today takes place in the Blackwood Valley region of the Appalachian Mountains. It was early January of the year 2026. The winter that year was exceptionally brutal. A massive polar vortex had settled over the eastern United States, plunging temperatures far below zero and blanketing the mountains in feet of dense, heavy snow. For most people, this was a time to stay indoors and drink hot coffee by the fireplace. But for two brothers named Sam and Marcus, the extreme weather presented a unique opportunity. Sam was 28 years old and Marcus was 32. They grew up in a small town right on the edge of the national forest. They spent their entire childhoods navigating the ridges and valleys of the Appalachians. They knew how to read the weather, they knew how to track animals, and they knew how to survive. They were the kind of guys who carried satellite beacons, extra thermal blankets, and waterproof fire starters on a simple day hike. They respected the wilderness, and they believed that their preparation made them invincible. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It is always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. On the morning of January 10th, 2026, Sam and Marcus decided to tackle a challenging route known as the Devil's Elbow. It was a steep, winding trail that offered a spectacular view of the valley, which would be perfect for the nature photography page they ran together. They packed their heavy winter gear, laced up their insulated boots, and set out from the trailhead at approximately 8:30 a.m. The air was crisp and painfully cold, stinging their cheeks as they walked. The sky above was a flat, pale gray, threatening more snow later in the afternoon. For the first few hours, the hike was exhausting, but beautiful. The trees were coated in a thick layer of frost that made the forest look like a crystalline palace. By the time it was 1:15 p.m., they had reached the halfway point of their ascent. They stopped to drink some water and eat some high-protein rations. Marcus pointed out that the clouds were dropping lower, obscuring the peaks around them. The wind, which had been a constant biting presence all morning, suddenly died down completely. In fact, the entire forest went dead silent. If you spend enough time in the deep woods, you learn that silence is not empty. Normal silence in nature is filled with the subtle sounds of life. The rustling of dead leaves, the distant call of a crow, the creaking of tree trunks swaying in the breeze. But what Sam and Marcus experienced in that moment was an absolute crushing void of sound. It was as if a thick, heavy blanket had been thrown over the entire world. The air felt thick and heavy, making it difficult to draw a full breath. This phenomenon is often referred to by survival experts and paranormal researchers as the Oz effect. It is a sudden sensory deprivation that makes you feel like you have been plucked out of reality and dropped into an isolated dimension. Sam felt a sudden knot of anxiety form in his stomach. He looked over at Marcus and saw that his older brother was also on edge, gripping his trekking poles tightly. They agreed to cut the hike short and head back down before the weather turned worse. They turned around and began the descent. It was 2:45 p.m. As they picked their way down a narrow, rocky ravine, the snow began to fall again. It wasn't a light dusting. It was heavy, wet snow that immediately began to stick to their goggles and coats. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Sam was walking about 10 paces ahead of Marcus, carefully navigating the slick rocks. Then Sam heard it. It was clear as day, cutting through the muffled quiet of the snowstorm. It was Marcus's voice. The voice said, "Hey, Sam, wait up for a second. My boot is untied." Sam stopped and turned around, expecting to see Marcus bending over. But Marcus was standing perfectly upright right behind him, looking confused. Marcus asked Sam why he stopped. Sam frowned and said, "I stopped because you told me your boot was untied." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, and the color drained from his face. Marcus whispered that he had not said a single word for the last 10 minutes. Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the freezing temperature. The voice had been perfect. It had the exact cadence, the exact tone, and the exact slight southern drawl that Marcus had. It wasn't an echo or the wind playing tricks. It was a deliberate mimicking of his brother. Before they could process what had just happened, the voice spoke again. This time it came from the thick brush about 30 yards up the side of the ravine to their left. It was Marcus's voice again, but this time it sounded panicked. The voice yelled, "Sam, I fell into a ditch. I think my leg is broken. Come help me, please." Both brothers stood frozen on the trail. Sam was looking at Marcus, who was standing right in front of him, wide-eyed and terrified. And yet they could both hear Marcus's voice crying out in agony from the dark trees above them. The psychological horror of that moment was paralyzing. Your brain is wired to respond to the distress of a loved one. Every fiber of Sam's being wanted to run up that hill to help his brother, but his brother was right next to him. Marcus reached out and grabbed Sam's jacket, pulling him hard down the trail. Marcus didn't yell. He whispered urgently, telling Sam to walk as fast as he could and not to look into the trees. They began to move rapidly, practically sliding down the snow-covered rocks. The panic was setting in, making their breathing ragged and loud. By 4:30 p.m., the woods were growing significantly darker. The storm was turning into a full whiteout. They realized with a sinking dread that in their haste they had veered off the main trail. They were lost in the Devil's Elbow as the sun was going down. They stopped in a small clearing surrounded by massive ancient pine trees to get their bearings. Sam pulled out his compass, but his hands were shaking so badly he dropped it in the deep snow. As he fell to his knees to dig for it, another sound pierced the silence. It was the sound of a woman crying. Not just any woman, it was the voice of their mother. Their mother lived in a comfortable suburban house over 200 miles away. She was in her late 50s and had bad knees. There was zero possibility she was out here in a sub-zero blizzard. Yet the voice echoing through the frozen timber was unmistakably hers. The voice sobbed, "Boys, where are you? I am so cold. Please do not leave me out here." Sam felt tears well up in his eyes. The mimic was no longer just copying sounds, it was reading them. It knew exactly what buttons to push to break their psychological resolve. The creature wanted them to separate. It wanted one of them to run into the dark out of blind love and panic. Marcus grabbed Sam by the shoulders and shook him hard. He told him to close his eyes and remember that their mother was safe at home. He told Sam that whatever was making that sound was an animal, a predator, and they were the prey. They decided they could not keep moving blindly in the dark. They needed to find shelter and survive the night. They found a large uprooted oak tree that had created a natural cave underneath its massive root system. They crawled into the dirt and snow, pulling dead pine branches over the opening to camouflage themselves. They unrolled their thermal sleeping bags and huddled together, shivering violently from both the cold and the sheer terror of their situation. The time was approximately 5:45 p.m. Total darkness had fallen. The night that followed was a master class in psychological torture. For the first few hours, the forest was quiet except for the howling of the wind. But around 11:30 p.m., the games began. They heard the crunching of heavy footsteps in the snow. It sounded like someone wearing large boots slowly walking in a wide circle around their hidden shelter. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. The footsteps were heavy, too heavy for a normal man. Then the voices started again. The entity did not just use the voices of their family. It began to replay conversations Sam and Marcus had earlier that day. They heard their own voices echoing in the dark, talking about the weather, talking about the trail as if a tape recorder was being played just outside their hiding spot. At one point, they heard the distinct robotic tone of a 911 operator asking, "What is your emergency?" Followed by static, followed by a horrific distorted scream that sounded like Sam. They clamped their hands over their ears trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to penetrate straight into their minds. They prayed silently, holding on to each other in the pitch-black, freezing dirt. At 3:15 a.m., the footsteps stopped right in front of the pile of branches they had used to hide the entrance. The brothers stopped breathing. They could hear a deep, rattling exhalation right on the other side of the dead pine needles. Slowly, one of the branches was pulled away. The moonlight was faint, reflecting off the white snow. In that dim, pale light, Sam and Marcus saw a face peering into their shelter. It was a nightmare made flesh. The head was roughly the shape of a human, but the proportions were completely wrong. The skin was pale and stretched tight over the skull, looking like old parchment. There was no nose, just two vertical slits. The eyes were massive, round, and completely milky white, shining with a faint, luminescent glow in the dark. But the most terrifying feature was the mouth. It was impossibly wide, stretching almost ear to ear, and it was moving, opening and closing, as if testing the jaw. From that gaping maw came the voice of their father. It whispered, "I am so disappointed in you boys." The creature reached a hand into the shelter. The hand was long, with 6 joints on each finger, ending in sharp blackened talons. It reached out inches from Sam's face. The smell that accompanied it was indescribable, like rotting meat mixed with ozone and old copper. Sam and Marcus did not scream. They knew that screaming would mean death. They sat absolutely rigid, their eyes locked on the entity, their minds reciting every prayer for protection they had ever learned. They focused entirely on a point of light in their own minds, refusing to give the creature the fear and the reaction it so desperately wanted. The creature paused. It tilted its head like a curious bird. It seemed confused by their lack of reaction. It lingered there for what felt like an eternity, its white eyes unblinking. And then slowly it withdrew its hand. It stood up, dropping the branch back into place. They heard the heavy crunching footsteps slowly fade away into the woods. They did not move for the rest of the night. They stayed in that root cave, muscles locked in agonizing cramps, until they saw the bright golden light of morning piercing through the branches. The time was 7:20 a.m. The storm had broken and the sky was a brilliant clear blue. They crawled out of the shelter. The snow around the fallen tree was covered in bizarre tracks. They looked somewhat like human footprints, but they were over 18 inches long and the toes ended in deep gouges in the frozen earth. The tracks circled the tree dozens of times before heading off into the densest part of the valley. Sam and Marcus did not speak. They packed their gear with trembling hands and found the trail using the position of the sun. They practically ran the remaining 5 miles down the mountain. They reached their truck at 10:40 a.m., locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. They went directly to the local ranger station and recounted their entire experience to the head ranger. They expected to be called crazy. Instead, the ranger locked the front door of the office and pulled down the blinds. He pulled out a thick file folder from his desk. He told them that they were the lucky ones. Over the past 3 months, 5 people had vanished in the Blackwood Valley. 2 of the search and rescue team members had also reported hearing the voices of their missing children calling them from the deep brush and refused to go back out. The ranger told them that whatever was up there was old and it was hungry and it was learning. The story of the Appalachian Mimic is a chilling reminder that the wilderness is not a park. It is a domain that belongs to nature and perhaps to things that exist just outside our understanding of the natural world. It preys on our deepest connections, using love and concern as a bait for a trap. This terrifying ordeal carries a profound moral lesson about the nature of deception and the strength of the human spirit. In life, we are constantly bombarded by voices that call out to us. Some of these voices try to lure us into dark places using familiarity or playing on our weaknesses and desires. They disguise themselves as things we care about to distract us from our true path. We are taught that the world is filled with unseen trials and that the greatest defense against deception is a grounded heart and a clear mind. When you encounter something that tries to manipulate your emotions, bringing you panic or despair, you must hold fast to the truth. You must recognize that true guidance brings peace, not terror. The brothers survived because they did not let their panic dictate their actions. They held on to their inner faith and maintained their composure in the face of absolute horror. This teaches us that even when the darkness tries to trick us by wearing the mask of someone we love, our spiritual vigilance and our reliance on the ultimate protector will shield us. Do not blindly follow every voice that calls your name. Verify the truth, seek the light, and never let fear drive you into the shadows. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. We upload videos just like this 3, 4, even 5 times a week. So if that sounds like something you would be interested in, please invite the like button to go on a winter hike in the Blackwood Valley. But right when you get to the darkest part of the woods, hide behind a tree and start perfectly imitating the sound of a dial-up modem. And do not forget to subscribe. Until next time, stay safe and do not answer back.
There's a very specific type of silence that exists only in the deep Alaskan wilderness during the dead of winter. It is not just an absence of sound. It is a heavy, suffocating pressure that presses against your eardrums. A physical weight that reminds you exactly how isolated you truly are. When the temperature drops to 40 degrees below zero, the air itself seems to freeze, trapping every echo and swallowing every noise before it can travel more than a few feet. In places like this, hundreds of miles away from civilization, your mind begins to crave any auditory input. You start to listen too closely to the settling of logs, the popping of sap, and the subtle shifting of the ice. But sometimes, when you listen too closely, you end up hearing things that should not be there at all. Before we dive into the frozen isolation of this story, I would love to know where you are watching or listening from right now. So drop your city or country in the comments below, especially if you are tucked away somewhere warm and safe. In late October of 2019, a man named Arthur decided he needed to disappear from the world for a while. Arthur was a seasoned outdoorsman, and a freelance wildlife photographer who had spent his entire life documenting the rugged landscapes of the Pacific Northwest. However, a grueling divorce and the series of professional setbacks had left him feeling entirely burned out. He needed a complete reset, a place where he could disconnect from the relentless noise of modern society. He found exactly what he was looking for in a classified advertisement for a remote hunting cabin located roughly 300 miles north of Anchorage, Alaska. The property was situated in a sprawling valley completely surrounded by jagged snow-capped peaks and dense spruce forests. There were no roads leading to the cabin. The only way in or out was by chartering a small bush plane, flying over endless miles of frozen tundra, and landing on a nearby frozen lake. Arthur packed his bags, gathering enough supplies, dried food, heavy winter clothing, and camera equipment to last him through the harshest part of the season. He chartered a flight with a local pilot in Anchorage. The flight took just over 2 hours, the small single-engine plane bouncing violently through the turbulent Arctic air before finally touching down on the slick, snow-swept surface of the frozen lake. The pilot, a grizzled older man who had flown in the territory for over 30 years, helped Arthur unload his heavy crates. The pilot looked around at the desolate landscape, the endless sea of white and dark green, and offered a final piece of advice. He told Arthur that the isolation out here plays brutal tricks on the human mind. He warned him to stick to a strict daily routine, to keep the fire burning hot, and to never wander too far into the tree line when the sun goes down. The sun, the pilot noted, would soon be setting for weeks at a time as the deep winter set in. With a final wave, the pilot climbed back into his cockpit, fired up the noisy engine, and lifted off into the gray sky. Arthur watched the plane become a tiny speck on the horizon before vanishing entirely. The moment the drone of the engine faded, that crushing absolute silence fell over the valley. He was entirely alone. The nearest town was hundreds of miles away. If he encountered an emergency, dialing 911 on a regular phone was impossible out here. His only lifeline was a bulky satellite phone locked in a protective case, meant to be used only to call the pilot when it was time to be picked up in early March of 2020. The cabin itself was a sturdy, well-built structure constructed from massive hand-peeled logs. It had been built back in 1974 by a fur trapper and had withstood decades of brutal Alaskan winters. The interior was a single large room, measuring 20 feet by 25 feet. In the exact center of the room sat a massive cast-iron wood-burning stove, its black metal belly resting on a thick pad of stone. A heavy metal chimney pipe extended straight up from the stove, passing through the high-vaulted ceiling and poking out through the thick cedar shingles of the roof. Along the back wall was a simple wooden counter for preparing meals, a hand pump sink that drew water from a deep well beneath the frost line, and a tall set of shelves stocked with canned goods. Above the kitchen area was a small open loft accessible by a sturdy wooden ladder. This loft contained a thick mattress wrapped in heavy wool blankets and a small window that looked out over the frozen lake. For the first 3 weeks, the isolation was exactly what Arthur needed. He established a rigorous grounding routine. Every morning he would wake up at 6:30 a.m., the air inside the cabin freezing cold, until he managed to reignite the embers in the stove. He would spend his mornings bundled in his heavy parka, walking along the perimeter of the lake to photograph the stark, terrifying beauty of the wilderness. He documented the way the low-hanging sun cast long, blue shadows across the snow. He photographed the rare tracks of snowshoe hares and red foxes. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun would dip completely below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep, icy darkness. Arthur would retreat to the cabin, spend 2 hours chopping firewood from a massive stack of logs behind the structure, and then lock the heavy oak door for the night. His evenings were spent sitting by the radiant heat of the iron stove, reading paperback novels by the yellowish glow of an oil lantern, and making copious notes in his journal. It was a simple, peaceful existence. The cabin felt like an impenetrable fortress against the deadly elements outside. The strange occurrences began during the second week of December. The weather had taken a severe turn. A massive low-pressure system had moved in over the mountains, bringing with it relentless snowfall and plunging temperatures that hovered around 50 degrees below zero. The snow piled up rapidly, accumulating over 3 feet deep on the roof of the cabin. The immense weight of the snow served as an excellent insulator, but it also made the cabin feel incredibly claustrophobic, like a buried tomb. It was a Tuesday night. Arthur had finished a meager dinner of canned stew and had climbed up the ladder into the loft to sleep. He was exhausted from spending hours earlier in the day shoveling a pathway from the front door to the woodshed. He pulled the heavy wool blankets up to his chin, listening to the comforting crackle of the wood-burning stove below him. The fire cast dancing orange shadows across the log walls. He drifted off to sleep around 10:15 p.m. At exactly 2:40 a.m., Arthur jolted awake. His eyes snapped open in the pitch-black loft. The fire had died down to a dull, glowing ember, leaving the cabin freezing and shrouded in darkness. For a moment, he did not know what had woken him. He lay perfectly still, his breath pluming in the freezing air, straining his ears against the absolute silence of the wilderness. Then he heard it. Directly above his head, on the exterior of the roof, there was a sound. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of snow compressing under immense weight. It sounded exactly like a boot stepping deeply into packed snow. Crunch. A long pause followed. Then another crunch. Arthur held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound was coming from the highest peak of the vaulted roof. The steps were incredibly slow and methodical. They were heavy, far heavier than any bird or small animal. A squirrel or a pine marten scurrying across the roof would make a light scratching noise. This was a deep, resonant thud that sent a faint vibration through the thick wooden beams of the ceiling. Crunch. The unseen entity took another step, moving slowly from the apex of the roof down toward the slope that overhung the front porch. Arthur lay frozen in his bed. His mind desperately raced to find a logical explanation. He tried to convince himself that it was simply the structural logs of the cabin shifting under the extreme cold, a phenomenon known as frost quakes. He told himself that the immense weight of the 3 feet of snow on the shingles was causing the ice to crack and settle. But as he listened, the pattern of the sound destroyed his rationalizations. The sounds were perfectly spaced, mimicking the bipedal gait of a massive human being wading through deep, resistant snow. The heavy steps continued down the slope of the roof, stopping just above the front door. Arthur waited, his eyes wide in the dark, expecting to hear the sound of something dropping heavily onto the wooden planks of the porch below. But the sound never came. There was only silence. The heavy, suffocating silence of the Alaskan winter returned, pressing against the walls of the cabin. Arthur did not sleep for the rest of the night. He lay perfectly still, grasping the cold metal handle of his flashlight, watching the faint gray light of dawn slowly bleed through the small loft window. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the sun was casting a weak, pale light over the frozen valley. Arthur finally summoned the courage to climb out of bed. He was exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He climbed down the ladder, his joints stiff from the cold, and stoked the embers in the stove, throwing in a large bundle of dry birch bark and heavy oak logs. Once the fire was roaring, he brewed a strong pot of black coffee, trying to shake the lingering terror of the night before. He convinced himself that daylight would bring clarity. He put on his thermal base layers, his thick insulated overalls, his heavy boots, and his thickest winter parka. He grabbed his .30-06 caliber hunting rifle from the rack by the door, slung it over his shoulder, and unbolted the heavy front door. The frozen air hit him like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in his nostrils. The world outside was a pristine, untouched ocean of white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue. Arthur stepped off the porch and waded into the deep, powdery snow, walking out about 40 feet from the cabin so he could get a clear, unobstructed view of the roof. He turned around and looked up. He fully expected to see the deep, sweeping tracks of a wolverine, or perhaps a massive lynx that had somehow managed to leap from a nearby spruce tree onto the roof. But what he saw made his blood run completely cold. The snow covering the roof was absolutely perfect. It was a smooth, unbroken blanket of brilliant white. There was not a single indentation, not a single scattered pile of snow, and absolutely zero tracks. The thick layer of fresh snow was completely undisturbed, looking exactly as it did when the storm had ended the previous evening. Arthur stood out in the freezing cold for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the roof in complete disbelief. He walked a full circle around the perimeter of the cabin, examining the ground. The snow all around the base of the cabin was equally pristine, save for his own fresh boot prints leading out from the front door. There were no animal tracks leading up to the walls. There were no broken branches on the nearby trees to suggest something had climbed up and jumped over. The roof was completely isolated, 10 feet off the ground at its lowest point. It was physically impossible for a living, breathing creature of massive weight to have walked across that snow without leaving deep, undeniable trenches. He returned inside, securely locking the heavy door behind him. He placed his rifle on the kitchen table and sat down, staring blankly at the flames licking behind the glass door of the stove. His mind was struggling to process the impossible contradiction. He knew what he had heard. He had felt the heavy vibrations traveling through the structural support beams. Yet, the physical evidence directly contradicted his senses. The deep isolation was finally beginning to show its teeth. Arthur spent the remainder of the day pacing the floor of the cabin, unable to focus on his photography or his reading. He found himself constantly glancing up at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to return. That night, Arthur decided he was not going to be caught off guard. He did not climb up into the loft to sleep. Instead, he pulled a heavy wooden rocking chair close to the wood-burning stove. He kept the fire burning as hot as possible, the iron radiating an intense, comforting heat throughout the room. He kept his loaded rifle resting across his lap, and he placed a heavy metal flashlight on the small table beside him. The hours dragged on with agonizing slowness. 9 p.m. passed, then midnight, then 2 o'clock in the morning. The absolute silence in the cabin was broken only by the crackle of the burning wood and the occasional howl of the wind whipping through the frozen tree branches outside. Arthur's eyelids grew incredibly heavy. Despite his fear, the exhausting adrenaline crash, combined with the immense heat of the stove, began to pull him into a deep slumber. At exactly 3:15 a.m., a massive, deafening boom shook the entire cabin. Arthur leaped out of his chair, the rifle clattering to the wooden floorboards. The noise was not a slow, methodical footstep. It sounded as though a boulder, weighing several hundred pounds, had been dropped directly out of the sky onto the very center of the roof. The impact was so violent that a fine layer of dust and dried tree sap rained down from the ceiling rafters, coating the kitchen counter and the floor. Arthur snatched his rifle from the floor and pointed the barrel toward the ceiling, his breathing rapid and shallow. He grabbed his flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the bright white beam across the massive log beams above his head. The heavy bipedal footsteps began immediately. But this time, they were not slow or methodical. They were fast, aggressive, and incredibly heavy. Crunch, 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 crunch. The unseen weight moved rapidly back and forth across the ridge of the roof, pacing with a frantic, furious energy. The structural logs of the cabin groaned and protested under the immense pressure, the wood screaming against the strain. Arthur backed away from the center of the room, retreating until his back hit the cold logs of the far wall. He aimed his flashlight at the section of the ceiling where the sounds were occurring, following the dreadful pacing back and forth. The weight above was so massive that Arthur could actually see the thick wooden planks of the ceiling bowing downward slightly as the entity crossed over them. Then, the pacing abruptly stopped. The entity had halted directly beside the metal chimney pipe that jutted out of the roof. Arthur stared at the black iron pipe protruding from the ceiling, leading straight down into his stove. The silence stretched out for 10 agonizing seconds. Then, a sound echoed down through the hollow metal cylinder that chilled Arthur to his very core. It was the sound of a long, rattling, incredibly deep exhalation. It was a wet, raspy breath, echoing down the metallic walls of the pipe, amplified by the hollow space. It sounded like massive lungs emptying themselves of freezing air directly into his cabin. Arthur screamed, the sound tearing raw from his throat, completely losing his composure. He aimed his rifle directly at the ceiling beside the pipe, his finger trembling violently against the metal trigger. He was fully prepared to fire a high-caliber round directly through the roof of his own shelter. He shouted into the darkness, demanding to know what was up there, threatening to pull the trigger. The only response was another long, rattling exhale echoing down the metal pipe, followed by the heavy, crunching sound of the entity taking 2 massive steps away from the chimney. Then, absolute silence. Arthur stood pinned against the wall for over 3 hours, his muscles locked in a state of sheer terror, until the pale light of dawn finally began to illuminate the frost-covered windows. Only then did he lower the barrel of his rifle. He felt entirely broken. The psychological torture of the impossible situation was tearing his mind apart. He knew exactly what he was going to find when he went outside, but he had to look. He had to know. He dressed in his heavy winter gear, unbolted the door, and stepped out onto the porch. He waded into the snow, walking far enough out to inspect the roof. It was perfect. The thick layer of white snow on the cedar shingles was completely undisturbed. Not a single boot print. Not a single displaced flake of snow around the metal chimney pipe. The pristine surface mocked him, daring him to doubt his own sanity. Arthur rushed back inside and immediately retrieved the satellite phone from its protective case. His hands shook violently as he powered on the device and extended the thick black antenna. He intended to call his pilot. He intended to demand an immediate extraction, regardless of the cost or the danger of flying in the winter conditions. He just needed to get away from this haunted structure. He stared at the small digital screen, waiting for the signal bars to appear. He waited 1 minute, then 2 minutes. The screen simply read that it was searching for a network. Arthur walked to the window, holding the phone up against the glass. No signal. He opened the front door and stood on the freezing porch, holding the heavy device high in the air. Still nothing. The thick cloud cover and the surrounding jagged mountains were completely blocking the satellite connection. He was completely, hopelessly trapped. Desperation set in. Arthur realized he had to survive in this cabin for at least another 12 weeks before the pilot was scheduled to return. He could not spend the next 3 months cowering in terror every single night. He needed answers. He began to tear the cabin apart, searching for anything that might offer an explanation. He pulled the canned goods off the shelves, inspecting the raw log walls behind them. He emptied the storage trunks tucked under the kitchen counter. Finally, while inspecting the wooden floorboards beneath the heavy bed in the loft, he noticed a long, rectangular piece of wood that seemed slightly loose. Using the flat edge of his hunting knife, Arthur carefully pried the floorboard up. Beneath it, hidden in a small alcove, packed with dry moss for insulation, was a small, tattered object wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas. Arthur pulled it out and unwrapped it. It was a thick, leather-bound journal. The leather was heavily distressed, worn smooth by years of handling. Arthur carried the journal down to the table by the stove, his hands trembling as he opened the stiff, yellowed pages. The handwriting was cramped, frantic, and barely legible, written in faded black ink. He flipped to the first page and read the date. It was written in November of 1984. The journal belonged to a man named Elias, the fur trapper who had originally built the cabin. Arthur sat by the warm fire and spent the next 6 hours reading the entries, feeling a sickening sense of dread wash over him with every turned page. Elias wrote about arriving at the cabin in late autumn. His early entries were mundane, detailing the number of pelts he had secured, the harshness of the weather, and his daily struggles to keep the fire going. But as the pages progressed into the deep winter months of December and January, the tone of the journal shifted drastically. Elias began to write about the profound, crushing silence of the valley. He wrote about feeling watched from the dense tree line. Then Arthur found an entry dated January 14th, 1985. Elias had written about being awakened in the middle of the night by a massive, heavy thud on the roof. Elias described the exact same agonizing sound of bipedal footsteps crunching through the deep snow above his head. He detailed his morning inspections, his absolute confusion and rising terror when he discovered the roof completely untouched. Arthur felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as he read. The phenomenon was not new. It was not a hallucination brought on by his own isolation. It had happened to the man who built this place over 30 years ago. The subsequent entries grew increasingly erratic and terrified. Elias documented the escalation. The entity, whatever it was, did not just walk on the roof. Elias described nights where the heavy, crunching footsteps would reach the edge of the roof overhang, and instead of dropping to the ground, the sound would continue straight down the vertical, exterior log walls of the cabin. The entity walked down the side of the building as if gravity did not exist, the heavy thuds vibrating through the walls right beside where Elias sat, cowering in the dark. The entries became shorter, messier, filled with desperate prayers and nonsensical ramblings about the spirits of the old mountains, ancient things that resented the presence of warm blood in their frozen domain. Elias wrote that the entity did not leave tracks because it did not possess a physical body in the way humans understand it. It was an ancient pressure, a manifestation of the wild, isolated cold itself. It only adopted the sound of weight to instill terror, feeding on the absolute dread of the trapped occupant inside. Arthur turned to the final written page in the book. The entry was barely legible, the pen having dug deeply into the paper, tearing the parchment in several places. The entry was dated February 2nd. Elias had written that the heavy footsteps were no longer confined to the exterior of the cabin. The previous night, Elias had heard the massive, crunching weight directly on the wooden floorboards of the loft above him, even though the trapdoor had been securely locked. The entity had found a way inside. The final sentence of the journal was a chilling, desperate warning. Elias wrote that he could not endure another night inside the structure. He wrote that he was leaving the cabin, walking out into the 50-degree below-zero blizzard to take his chances in the freezing endless white. Because freezing to death in the snow was far better than being inside the cabin when the entity finally descended the ladder. Arthur slowly closed the thick leather book. His breathing was shallow. He looked around the dimly lit cabin, the heavy log walls suddenly feeling less like a protective sanctuary and far more like the walls of a wooden cage. The man who built this place had been driven completely mad by the exact same unseen terror, eventually walking out into the freezing wilderness to his certain death. The local authorities had likely assumed Elias had simply become lost and succumbed to the elements, completely unaware of the invisible nightmare that had driven him out. Arthur realized that he was now trapped in the exact same cycle, and the sun was already beginning to set on his 4th day in the cabin. The deep, dark Alaskan night was rapidly approaching. Arthur refused to meet the same fate. He was not going to run out into the freezing night. He spent the remaining daylight hours heavily fortifying his position. He moved the heavy wooden kitchen table and dragged it directly in front of the thick oak door, barricading it shut. He took every single piece of chopped firewood he had stored inside and stacked it around the base of the cast iron stove, ensuring he had enough fuel to keep a roaring, blindingly hot fire burning for the next 48 hours without needing to step outside. He loaded his 30-06 rifle, chambering around, and placed his heavy hunting knife on the table beside him. He sat down in his rocking chair, facing the center of the room, positioned so he had a clear view of both the front door and the wooden ladder leading up to the dark, empty loft. He placed the heavy metal flashlight in his lap. He promised himself he would not sleep. He would sit awake, staring into the flickering firelight until the sun returned. The darkness outside became absolute. The temperature plummeted severely, the cold radiating through the thick log walls, fighting a losing battle against the intense, blistering heat of the overloaded stove. The wind began to howl around 9:30 p.m., a fierce, shrieking gale that battered the exterior of the cabin, rattling the thick glass panes of the windows. Arthur sat perfectly rigid, listening to the chaotic symphony of the storm. The wind was so loud he feared it would mask the approach of the heavy footsteps. He strained his ears, jumping at every sudden gust or snapping branch in the distance. At exactly 11:50 p.m., the chaotic, howling wind abruptly stopped. It did not gradually fade away. It ceased instantly, completely, as if someone had thrown a massive switch and simply turned off the atmosphere. The sudden transition from deafening noise to crushing, absolute silence was physically painful. Arthur felt the heavy, oppressive pressure build inside his ears, the same pressure you feel before a massive thunderstorm breaks. The air inside the cabin suddenly smelled metallic, like copper wire and burnt ozone. Arthur gripped his rifle tightly, his knuckles turning stark white. He slowly raised the barrel, pointing it toward the dark, vaulted ceiling. Then the sound returned. It did not start on the roof this time. A massive, deafening thud impacted the thick, wooden wall right behind Arthur's chair. The entire cabin shook violently, a framed photograph falling from the kitchen shelf and shattering on the floorboards. Arthur threw himself forward out of the chair, rolling across the rough wooden floor and bringing his rifle up, aiming directly at the solid log wall. The heavy crunching footsteps began, but they were not on the ground outside. They were moving horizontally across the vertical exterior wall of the cabin. Thud, thud, thud. The impossible, staggering weight was walking slowly across the outside of the building, the massive logs groaning under the immense pressure. Arthur tracked the sound with the barrel of his rifle, walking backward toward the center of the room. The entity paced slowly from the back corner, moving deliberately along the right side of the structure, heading toward the front porch. The heavy steps reached the corner of the cabin. Arthur held his breath, the metallic smell of ozone growing sickeningly strong in the confined space. Then the sound shifted. The entity stepped off the vertical wall and stepped heavily onto the wooden planks of the front porch. The thick floorboards outside creaked agonizingly under the immense weight. Arthur spun around, aiming his rifle directly at the heavy oak door. He stood 10 feet away, his heart hammering in his throat, waiting for the massive iron hinges to give way. The heavy footsteps took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward the door. Crunch, crunch. They stopped directly in front of the entryway. The silence stretched tight, a physical rubber band pulled to its absolute breaking point. Arthur watched in abject terror as the heavy iron latch of the front door slowly began to lift. The metal handle turned downwards, accompanied by a loud metallic squeal. The unseen entity outside was trying to open the door. The latch cleared the heavy metal catch, but the massive wooden barricade Arthur had constructed held the thick oak firmly in place. The door rattled violently against the frame, pushed by a massive unseen force. Arthur raised his voice, screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with pure primal terror. He screamed at the entity to leave him alone, shouting that he was armed, shouting into the terrifying void of the wild. The rattling at the door instantly stopped. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Arthur kept his rifle leveled at the door, refusing to blink, refusing to lower his weapon. He stood in the center of the room, his muscles burning for what felt like an eternity. He did not hear the entity walk away. He did not hear it climb back up the walls or step out into the snow. The terrible, oppressive presence simply seemed to evaporate into the freezing night air. Arthur remained standing in the exact same spot, staring at the door for the next 7 hours. He did not move a single inch until the pale gray light of the late dawn finally began to creep through the frosted windows. When the sun finally rose high enough to cast shadows across the wooden floor, the metallic smell of ozone faded, replaced once again by the familiar scent of wood smoke. Arthur survived the rest of his time in that cabin, but he did not live. He existed in a state of hyper-vigilant paranoia. He never slept for more than a few hours at a time, always during the brightest part of the short day. He kept a loaded weapon within arm's reach at all times. He never went further than 10 feet from the front porch to chop wood. And he never ever went outside after the sun went down. The unseen entity never returned to the cabin walls, nor did it walk upon the roof again. But Arthur could always feel it. Whenever he stared out into the dark, dense tree line surrounding the frozen lake, he could feel the massive, ancient presence watching him, patiently waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to step too far into the shadows. On the 3rd day of March, the beautiful loud drone of a small bush plane engine finally broke the crushing silence of the valley. Pilot Thomas landed the plane smoothly on the frozen lake, taxiing over to the cabin edge. When Thomas climbed out of the cockpit, he was deeply shocked by Arthur's appearance. The previously vibrant and healthy photographer looked like a hollow, haunted shell of a man. His eyes were deeply sunken, his face pale and gaunt, his movements jerky and panicked. Arthur did not speak a single word as he frantically threw his bags and camera equipment into the cargo hold of the small plane. He climbed into the passenger seat and simply stared straight ahead, gripping his knees tightly until his knuckles turned white. He did not look back at the log structure as the plane lifted off the ice and soared into the sky. He kept his eyes fixed forward until the dense, jagged mountains finally gave way to the sprawling, safe civilization of Anchorage. Arthur never spoke publicly about what he experienced in that remote cabin, nor did he ever publish the photographs he took during those long, freezing months. He moved back to the lower states and never set foot in the wild again. However, before he left Alaska, he spent days digging through the old territorial land records in the Anchorage Public Library, desperate to find some sort of closure. He discovered that the original trapper, Elias, was officially listed as a missing person in the spring of 1985. When authorities finally visited the cabin to check on him, they found the door wide open, the wood stove completely cold, and all of Elias's belongings left behind exactly as they were. No trace of him was ever found in the surrounding wilderness. The vast, untouched corners of our world hold secrets that we are simply not meant to understand. There are deep, ancient places entirely ruled by isolation and cold, places that operate completely outside the boundaries of logic and physics. When we venture far out into that profound silence, we must remember that we are not the masters of that domain. We are simply uninvited guests, trespassing in a deeply terrifying territory that belongs to the heavy unseen things waiting in the endless white.